Tantor Audio presents Rock Courtship by Nalini Singh, narrated by Justine Keef. Shatter. David shoved his hands through his hair and blew out a breath. He was a rock star. It said so in the magazine on Thea's waiting room table. It even called him the gentleman of rock. Surely someone that smooth should have his moves down pat. "Breathe, David." Damn it, you'd think this was the first time he'd asked a woman out on a date. Yeah, okay, he'd been a little shy as a teenager, but he'd grown out of that. Or maybe not. When you were part of a rock band whose albums had gone triple platinum, one after the other, women tended to ask you out. The first time it had happened, he'd just about fallen flat on his ass. Fox, Noah, Abe, he could see women asking them out, but him? That had been his reaction as a 19-year-old who'd been the shortest kid in his grade until he was 17. The fact he'd shot up to a respectable adult height the summer before his senior year and put on muscle during the course of that year had still been sinking in. All those women hitting on him after the band soared up the charts had altered things on a superficial level, while leaving the deeper part of him unchanged. Inside, he remained the short, scrappy, brown-eyed, brown-haired kid who'd ended up in plenty of fistfights and never gotten the girl. He wasn't sure if any of the groupies actually saw him. For most, it was more about the cachet of being with the drummer from schoolboy choir. He could have been a drug-addicted fuckwit or a lech with no social skills and bad body odor, and he'd still have ended up with women who wanted to bang a rock star and weren't particular about the details. So yeah, that didn't exactly count as success in the female department. Not here. Not when he was about to ask out the girl. The one who made his heart kick and his body ignite and his tongue tie itself into knots. And of course she was taller than him, especially in the ankle-breaker heels she liked to wear. Without them, the two of them were a bare 2 inches apart in height. He couldn't think about what that would translate to in bed, or he'd walk into her office with a big fucking hard-on, and this was already going to be a tough sell. Thea was gorgeous and brilliant at her job. She was also an ice queen when it came to the clients for whom her firm handled publicity. The majority of those clients were male musicians used to women falling at their feet. They respected Thea for standing her ground. David just respected her, period. He wasn't doing this on a whim or to add a notch to his belt. He was gone for her, seriously head over heels. He'd almost killed the bastard who'd been her fiancé 1,000 times over during the course of her engagement, but now she was rid of the loser. This was David's chance, the most important of his life, even more so than the break that had led to the album deal that had catapulted schoolboy choir into the stratosphere. If he hesitated now and some other man entered her life, he'd never forgive himself. Taking a deep breath and reminding himself of the points he intended to make to get Thea to agree to go on a date with him, he lifted his hand and knocked on her door. He'd deliberately arrived after the time he knew her assistant usually went home, so he didn't have to run that particular gauntlet at least. "Come on in!" A smile tugging at his lips at the sound of her voice. Shit, he was so fucking gone. He opened the door and stepped inside. It was only because he watched her so often when she wasn't aware of him that he caught the flicker in her smile, the sudden wariness in those up-tilted eyes of burnished brown. A split second and she'd smoothed her initial response away to replace it with the professional smile he'd seen her use on everyone, from magazine editors to record executives. Beautiful and warm, and not real. A sucker punch to the gut couldn't have hurt more, but he was prepared for this reaction, took the blow without flinching. "David!" She rose and walked around the glass desk she kept clear of the usual office detritus, but that was covered with documents relating to the million things she had going on at any one time. Mock-ups of posters she had to sign off on, copies of magazine articles by journalists pitching to interview her clients, notes about useful promotional ideas, it was all there. Her phone sat where her right hand would be when she was in her chair, a cup of coffee where her left would be. The sight was so familiar it eased the knot in his gut. "Hey, Thea." There he went, being all smooth and sophisticated. "Busy day?" Okay, that came out as planned. Now all he had to do was work in the offer of a drink someplace where she could relax. He'd already scouted an upscale bar where the music was live, but the volume low enough that they could talk. You wouldn't believe it. She put one hand on her lower back and rubbed lightly, her slender body lithe and beautiful in the pale gray sheath dress she wore with chunky turquoise beads and strappy heels that drew his attention to her long, long legs. He had no idea how she walked all day on those ice picks, but God, he liked the view. The fantasies he had about Thea's legs. "The magazine thing I told you about," she said, her fine-boned face lit with laughter, and the straight, silky black of her hair in a sleek twist that had begun to unravel just a tiny bit, her skin a flawless smooth gold. "Well, turns out the photographer wanted to get you guys in a bathtub for an avant-garde shoot." David blinked, momentarily diverted from his path. "All four of us?" "Yes, naked." "Jesus." "No?" A teasing question, her smile no longer so agonizingly professional. "Hell no!" He shuddered. "We don't like each other that much. How the hell would he fit the entire band in a tub anyway?" Thea snorted with laughter, and suddenly she was the Thea he knew again, the one who wasn't so icy behind her professional facade, and whose sense of humor had a wicked bite. "Only way to find out is to do it." Smile deep, she arched an eyebrow. "Should I give the photographer a call?" "Very funny." Realizing he was in danger of getting totally off track, he bit the bullet and laid his heart on the line. "So, I was thinking we could grab a drink, unwind together." He'd gotten back into L.A. an hour ago after an out-of-state gig at a music festival. It was as good an excuse as any to put her at ease, make this seem less date-like. Smile fading from her eyes, though her lips remained curved, she said, "I wish I could, but I have a dinner meeting with a television producer about a new entertainment show." Not about to give up, David slipped his hands into the back pockets of his jeans and said, "Tomorrow?" "Another working dinner, I'm afraid." The knot in his gut was now a jagged rock that made it difficult to breathe. "Lunch?" he asked with a grin, making light of her rebuff and giving her the opening to suggest another time, another meal, a simple 15 minutes to grab a drink or a coffee, anything. Thea's laugh was rueful. "Booked into next year." "Working, huh?" He managed to get out, though he felt as if he'd had the stuffing kicked out of him. "You know me, a workaholic." She glanced at the thin silver band of her watch. "Speaking of which, I'd better get back to it. I need to call someone in Tokyo, and I know the man I need to reach will be in his office about now." Smiling that perfect smile that cut like a knife, she walked him to the door. "It was nice to see you." Gutted at the absolute rejection, for all that had been professionally delivered, he just went. He understood when a woman meant no, and he never ever wanted to make Thea feel cornered or threatened. But he had to make sure she had meant no, that he hadn't misread a signal that said try harder. So he did something about which he wasn't proud, but he'd long ago stopped being proud when it came to his feelings for Thea. Parking his car half a block up from her office in a refurbished house in Beverly Hills, he waited. When she came out 40 minutes later, he followed her to her destination. It wasn't a restaurant or even an office block where she could have conceivably had that dinner meeting. It was her apartment building. And because she had a window seat where she settled in with her laptop a few minutes later, her hair down and her dress replaced by what looked like a tank top, over what must be shorts, he knew she wasn't expecting professional company. Thea hadn't had a working date. She hadn't had any kind of date. She just didn't want him. Thea finally stopped trying to get some work done and went to raid her stash of peanut butter cream Oreos. Grabbing a tall glass of milk, she sat down at the round kitchen table that had come with the apartment and methodically demolished 4 of the cookies. She didn't tear them apart, didn't eat the creamy filling and the cookie separately. She bit directly into each one, chewing the bite dry before chasing it down with milk. It should have been intensely satisfying, a treat she saved for days when she dealt with too many dickheads and idiots. Today she'd had a tough day, but it had ended even tougher. Not because David was either a dickhead or an idiot, but the opposite. He was smart, talented, bone-meltingly sexy. Gorgeous eyes of light brown she'd seen turn gold with his mood, rich mahogany hair with strands of bronze, a strong muscled body and warm-toned skin that made her want to run her hands all over him. He couldn't be more delicious. Throw in that heartbreaking smile and his personality, and David was a bitably perfect package of man. He was also a client. Schoolboy choir as a group was her biggest client by far. Even more importantly, they were clients she liked. Fox, Noah, Abe, and David had their moments, but for the most part, the 4 were amazing to work with. They took their music seriously and extended the same courtesy to her. Even when one or more of them bitched about the publicity she organized, they were consummate professionals on the day. Okay, so Abe had gone off on a reporter last year, but the little weasel had been asking for it. In no universe was it a good idea to shove a picture of a man's not-yet ex-wife under his nose after he'd come off a turbulent red-eye flight, especially when that picture showed said not-yet ex-wife pregnant with another man's child. Thea would never admit it to Abe, but she'd cheered a tiny bit inside when he slugged that reporter. And she was babbling inside her head because she didn't want to think about what had happened in her office. "David asked me out," she said to the eggshell white walls that had been a screaming pink when she moved in. That had been 6 months ago, 3 hours after she found her fiancé with his face buried between the thighs of an ex-cheerleader shopping for a corporate husband. Slamming the door shut on that ugly memory, because she refused to allow Eric and his bimbo to steal any more of her emotional energy, she rubbed her hand over her face. Damn it, why did it have to be David? Part 1. 4 months later. Chapter 1. David didn't bother to tell any of the others he was heading out. The rest of the band, as well as the long-term crew, all knew he liked to take a long, quiet walk the night before a show. Sometimes it took a bit of fancy footwork to slip out unnoticed, but on the whole, it wasn't too bad. He was lucky. He tended to attract far less media attention than Fox, Noah, and Abe. Tonight it had been even easier than usual. Most of the media hounds had gone home, and the ones still hanging around weren't going to waste their time tailing the gentleman of rock when they might get a titillating shot of one of the others doing sexy things with a beautiful woman. Leaving the area immediately around the Sydney hotel where the band was staying pre-concert, he flipped up the hood of his dark gray sweatshirt, shoved his hands into the pockets of his black pants, and started walking. He should have changed from his tailored white shirt and black pants to jeans and a tee, but he'd wanted to get out of the hotel too much to waste even 5 more minutes. He could remember exactly when he'd begun to take these walks, way back during Schoolboy Choir's first-ever national tour. Overwhelmed by the attention and the constant demands from people who wanted a piece of him, he just needed to breathe. Ironic how that was. When he'd been a kid in a tiny apartment in the Bronx, he dreamed of a shiny car and a big house, and when he could afford all that and more, the only thing he wanted was the anonymity of walking the city streets. Sydney was a city he'd visited before with the band, so instead of sticking to the main drags, he wandered off the beaten path. It was on his way back to the hotel over an hour later that he found himself on what appeared to be the fringe of a red-light district. The shadowed and slightly seedy streets filled with strip clubs and hole-in-the-wall bars suited his current mood. "Get over her, David," he told himself, not for the first time. Take a woman home and fuck it out. Except even as he spoke, he knew it wasn't that easy. He'd tried after Thea made it clear she had no interest in him. 2 nights after her rejection, he'd found himself at a party overflowing with leggy models who had a soft spot for rock musicians. A raven-haired beauty with pillowy lips and generous breasts had draped herself all over him, whispering an explicit invitation in his ear. It had involved the bathroom floor and her on her knees in front of him. How fucked up was it that he turned her down? As fucked up as the fact that he was being faithful to a woman who didn't want him. Frustrated with himself for still being so damn hurt, he shoved a hand through his hair, pushing off the hood as he came within sight of another random bar, with a beat-up black door and no bouncer. Deciding he might as well get a beer if he was going to brood, he walked into the dark and dingy place full of scarred wooden tables and hard men. They looked like construction workers and bricklayers he'd run errands for as a boy, before he'd won the scholarship to the boarding school where he'd met his best friends. His shoulders eased. He felt far more comfortable in a place like this than in the 5-star restaurants and fancy clubs where everyone expected chart-topping musicians to hang out. "Beer, whatever you have on tap," he said to the grizzled bartender and grabbed a stool, his eye on the rugby game in progress on the TV screen bolted above the bar. He'd hardly taken a sip of his beer, the dark liquid bitingly cold, when he felt a presence at his back. Instincts, honed by a childhood in one of the toughest areas of New York, had him focusing on the mirror behind the bar to check out the situation before he turned. A big, bald, and heavily muscled male with a spiderweb tattoo on his neck was standing behind and just to the side of David, a smirk on his pock-marked face. Belly heating, David turned with a slight smile. "Problem?" The bald man bared his teeth and, laughing, looked to a table to his right. "Hear that, boys?" he called out to his friends. "The pussy rock star here wants to know if there's a problem." Laughter and shouts from that particular table, while the rest of the men in the bar went quiet. David didn't move, taking a measure of the players without letting it show. Always know your opponent had been one of the first things his father had taught him. Vicente Rivera didn't believe in turning the other cheek. He believed in teaching his sons how to put bullies on the ground and keep them there. "Yeah, there's a problem," the bald guy said, shoving at David's shoulder. "This is a real bar for real men, not pussies." Like that, then. Good. He was in the mood to do some violence. Lifting his beer, David took a long drink, then slammed it down and punched Baldhead in the jaw at the same time that he kicked out with his foot to connect with the other man's knee. The jackass went down like a ton of bricks. Roaring in rage, the man's friends came at David. He grinned and started to show them what this pussy rock star could do. It wasn't until they'd broken a table and several chairs and the bartender had called the cops that David realized Thea would have to deal with the fallout from this. Fuck, 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 he thought as he was shoved into a cell alone, his erstwhile opponents in the cell opposite. Sliding down the graffiti-marked wall to the floor, he thought about the phone call the desk sergeant had said he could make and decided against it. Fox had Molly with him. The band's lead singer had been waiting for his girl to arrive since the instant schoolboy choir set foot in the city. As for Noah and Abe, they both had their own plans. He knew any one of the 3 men would drop those plans in an instant to come to his aid. But since the cops had made it clear he'd be spending the night in a cell no matter what, why mess up their plans? "You do or say anything that'll hit the media, you call me, day or night. I hate surprises, so don't you dare surprise me." Thea had given that order to all 4 of them when she'd agreed to act as their publicist. Her upfront nature and dedication to her job was part of the reason they'd hired her. Thea was the best, and she didn't take any shit from her clients. He wasn't doing himself any favors by not calling her. Right then, David couldn't find it in himself to care. It wasn't as if she could hurt him any more than she already had. And Jesus, how long was he going to carry this torch that was burning him alive? "Fuck, fuck, fuck," he said aloud, banging the back of his head against the wall. Thea was on her third cup of coffee when the phone rang. Seeing Fox's name on the screen, she frowned. She was awake at this hour because she wanted to finalize a few things before she headed off on vacation later today, after handling the band's scheduled media interviews. Fox, however, was with Molly, so if he was wasting time calling her, it had to mean trouble. "Fox, what's happened?"
"David's in jail."
Thea collapsed onto a sofa, her mind spinning. "David? Don't you mean Abe or Noah?"
"David,"
Fox repeated.
"He got in a bar fight, did enough damage that—"
Heart thumping, she broke into his words. "Is he all right?"
"Black eye, bruised ribs, but he came out better than the other guys. I'm on my way to pick him up from the station, but the media's probably already gotten hold of the story."
Eyes narrowing, Thea sat up. "When was this bar fight?"
"Last night. And yeah, I know he should have called you then, but he didn't. Can you handle it?"
"Of course I can handle it." Taking down the details he had, including the name of the bar, she disconnected and began to do her job, which in this case meant damage control. A rock star misbehaving wasn't a big deal generally, but it all depended on how the media decided to report it, and it could get nasty if they pitched it as an arrogant international musician throwing his weight around against locals. First, she rang up the bar and spoke to the owner. "Mr. Rivera apologizes for the damage," she said, putting words in David's mouth. "We'd be happy to cover the bill for any repairs. Please send it straight to me." The bar owner guffawed, loud and long.
"No, don't worry. I'm making the dipshits pay for it, the ones who started it. Your guy was just having a beer and watching the rugby until Bruiser decided to prove his dick was bigger. Picked the wrong mark this time."
David had gone up against someone named Bruiser. Not only that, he'd come out of the altercation better off. And both Fox's use of the word guys and the bar owners of dipshits meant Bruiser hadn't been David's only opponent. Thea was having difficulty comprehending any of this. Of all the men in the band, David was the most stable. He was the one who made the band a family, and she wasn't sure any of the four men even realized it. David was the calm center in the midst of the storm, rooted and so sure of who he was that nothing could shake him. He did not get into bar fights. He did not put Thea in the position of having to clean up after him. He did not end up in jail with a black eye and bruised ribs. Except he'd done exactly that. "Here are my contact details, just in case," she said to the bar owner, not about to allow her frustration and shock to stop her from doing her job. "You'll probably get some media attention."
"Already spoke to a few reporters," the man replied cheerfully. "Phone's been ringing off the hook."
Thea slapped a hand silently over her forehead and bit back a groan. She was seriously going to strangle David. "Well," she said, trying to salvage what she could of the situation, "if you need any assistance dealing with them—" The bar owner interrupted her again.
"No, I can handle it. I told them the drummer guy beat the crap out of the bozos who were hassling him. That boy learned his moves somewhere where they don't fight pretty, that's for sure."
Thea released a relieved breath, the publicist in her immediately seeing the positive angle. Yes, the gentleman of rock had been in a bar fight against locals, but he hadn't started it, and he'd come out of it the victor against multiple opponents. Everyone liked the underdog who'd beaten the bullies, especially when the underdog was a sexy, straight-arrow rock star who generally stayed out of the media spotlight. So she played that angle, laughed good-naturedly with reporters as she gently nudged things in the direction she wanted them to go. Then, logging into David's main social media account, which he usually only used to answer fan questions, she pretended to be him and began to type out a message. He could yell at her later. Not that David ever yelled. But he'd made it clear she was only ever to touch his account if he was held up somewhere and fans were waiting for a concert or something else equally important. As far as Thea was concerned, this qualified. "Damn it," she muttered, erasing what she'd already written to start all over again. A laughing, smirking admission wouldn't sound like David. But she couldn't allow him to maintain radio silence, not this time. The print and online media could still spin the story the wrong way if she didn't give them another angle bolstered by fan support. That boy learned his moves somewhere where they don't fight pretty, that's for sure. The memory of the bar owner's admiring statement made her mind click. Fingers to the keyboard of the lightweight laptop that acted as her virtual office, she wrote, "I guess no one told them I was born and raised in the South Bronx." There, she thought, that was David. No explanations, just a proud shout-out to his old neighborhood, a neighborhood his parents and siblings continued to call home. Of course, his folks and younger brothers were no longer in a shoebox apartment in a tenement building, but on the top floor of a spacious new 5-story complex. Because David was a man who respected the meaning of family, the one he'd created with the band, and the one into which he'd been born. She knew he'd offered to move his family to a more gentrified area of New York, and an even nicer place. But the Riveras liked their part of the Bronx and didn't want to sit on their asses all day, mooching off their son. David had said that to her, paraphrasing his parents, when he told her his folks had no intention of retiring. The admiration and affection in his tone had made her want to kiss him. In quiet respect for their pride, he'd bought the complex, then convinced Vicente and Alicia Rivera that he needed them as live-in managers. They were meant to oversee the small staff that took care of any physical maintenance, but his father apparently couldn't help himself at times, and neither could his mother. Their building not only had a thriving rooftop garden, but was so spick and span that there was a waiting list of potential tenants. Grinning, she added another line to David's message. "Anyone mentions this to my mother, I will find you." The band's fans all knew Mrs. Rivera, the mom who'd helped bring up David and his 2 younger brothers by cleaning business offices and rich people's homes from 5 in the morning to 2 in the afternoon. His father was a construction worker who'd pulled 14-hour shifts after getting the kids off to school, with his mom always there when they returned home. Despite their hard work, the family had lived on fumes at times. The poverty in his past was something David had never hidden. He had, however, made sure his younger brothers weren't hounded by the media by scrupulously keeping them out of his public profile. His beaming mom, on the other hand, he'd brought as his date to the Grammys 2 years running. Mrs. Rivera had charmed everyone who met her. David's dad wasn't as comfortable in the spotlight, but his pride in his boy was clear in the rare interviews he'd granted. Thea knew for a fact that David returned to New York regularly to help his parents with anything they needed, and that he was the first port of call for his brothers, both of whom were now at Ivy League universities, thanks to the educational trust funds David had set up. Was it any wonder she found him so attractive? No, she said the instant after that thought passed through her head. No. David, she reminded herself for the gazillionth time, was a client. He was also a musician. Thea had been around too many who lived the rock and roll lifestyle to trust any of them. Maybe it wasn't fair to tar all musicians with the same brush, but she'd had her heart stomped on once by a cheating, lying son of a bitch. No way was she ever again handing it over to any man she wasn't dead certain would handle it with care. Rock stars were just not a good bet. Chapter 2. David was expecting to take some bullshit from the guys when he walked into the hotel's breakfast room with Fox and the band's local attorney. He was still dressed in the black pants and white shirt from last night, but despite the color, the shirt had survived miraculously unscathed under the hoodie he'd chucked into the trash. Splattered with more than a few liquid substances, including whiskey and blood, the hoodie had looked like it came from the costume department of a horror movie. As it was, he had no trouble handling the ribbing from the males around the table. It was Thea's sister, Molly, who moved the conversation to a dangerous emotional level. Though the two women shared a father, they looked nothing alike.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?